relationship with someone when you start exchanging sexual history, telling more and more intimate parts of your story. That's how we think about ourselves. That's how we move through the world, as storied beings. Heidegger called us beings unto death. I prefer to talk about us as narrated selves, or storied beings. The fact that we're beings unto death makes time important, and that gives rise to us thinking about ourselves in terms of stories. And we become storied beings, or narrated selves. So where does religion come into that undeniable truth about who we are? Well, this is where I'll introduce you to somebody, and you can actually impress Father Bruce by dropping his name in conversation. Father Bruce will dig you for doing this. He's a Jesuit guy, Karl Rahner. And what Rahner did was he hijacked Martin Heidegger's semi-Christian but mostly atheist philosophy and made use of it to articulate Christian thought. Rahner basically said that we have an instinct for the divine, that we have an impulse for self-transcendence. Whether you're religiously inclined or not, all of us are kind of bound by this resistance to our mortality. You've got an immortality consciousness about yourself. You've got an immortality project that you're involved in. And Rahner says that is actually a gift of God. It's a gift of God's self-communication. That you have this instinct, this impulse for transcendence. It's one thing to recognize this bit about ourselves, that we're story beings, that we understand ourselves by way of story. But Rahner says that this is rarely satisfying. That I was born on November 8th, 1971. Don't hack me. Don't steal my identity. But at some point in the future, I'll die. And between those 2 points, it's just one damn thing after another. That's rarely satisfying. We want adventure. We want that story to mean something beyond the confines of just this short time, this intermediate space in the universe. So we have a desire to connect our story somewhere outside of ourselves, to have a transcendent story. Well, Rahner doesn't use the term, but you have probably heard it because it's been a bit of our cultural vocabulary probably for at least the last 25, 30 years. And it's this term. Meta-narrative. A meta-narrative is the big story. We have little stories. You have a story, I have a story, we have little stories. But all of us are grasping for this sense of transcendence that we are aiming to construct and to connect our little stories in light of a much bigger story. So what's an obvious big story? Well, one of the big obvious big stories is the story of the Christian faith. How do you account for all these individual stories in this room? Well, the Christian faith comes in and says, through the lens of our experience of Jesus, we come to understand that humanity started out creatures in the image and likeness of God and very good, but we screwed that up by our disobedience and fell into sin. And because we couldn't extract ourselves from our jam, from our sin, God had to get in the game. And so God becomes incarnate in the person of Jesus. And Jesus becomes the hero of the story. That through his life and his death and his resurrection, not only himself triumphs over death and evil, but by means of his work, you get to share in that gift too. And the idea is that because we've connected this story to this story, we are now no longer beings unto death, but beings unto resurrection. Oh, that's a Christian story. That's a Christian meta-narrative. Little stories fitting into the big story. Now, different religions will tell the big story differently. And so you have in each world religion, each philosophical transcendental system, a big story. You know, the Islam tells a story about Muhammad's encounter with Allah and about our duty spelled out in the Quran to find ourselves in submission to Allah and therefore to share in the salvation that Allah brings. And that gets all summarized down into a nice, pithy confessional statement that there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. A meta-narrative, a bigger story into which all of these little stories that each of us are invited to share in, connecting into that bigger story. You know, Buddhism has a big story, you know, that the end goal is enlightenment. And it is enlightenment according to the experience of the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, sitting under a bo tree, finds enlightenment. And through the path that has been blazed by the Buddha, you come and you're inaugurated, invested into a bigger story. So that's what meta-narratives are. Religions are a meta-narrative. But you don't even have to have religious meta-narratives. You have meta-narratives that have been communicated to us by society. I was at one time, had a full head of hair. Back when I was about your age, it went down to the middle of my back, and I had my kinked out Metallica perm. And my dream was to go to L.A. and join a heavy metal band. It's hilarious. I agree. It's not something I'm proud of, but the meta narrative that had been given to me from these 1980s hair bands was he who has the most toys at the end of the game, he who dies with the most toys wins. So I thought, oh, how can I hook into that meta narrative?
What instrument did you play?
I play bass now, but I played guitar then.
I would refer to Metallica as a hairband.
Oh, no, definitely. Metallica is not a hairband. No, that is true.
That is kind of insulting.
Yeah, it is. No, I just liked Hammett's hair.
Poison, maybe.
Yeah, no, definitely Poison. But you get the idea. Consumer capitalism has given you a story. Why do thousands of people think that Donald Trump is going to make a great president? Well, you've got a story, man. He's a guy who can. Here's a guy that grew up in New York, took some of his father's inheritance, spun that into $1 billion empire,
and then declared bankruptcy.
Yeah, a few times.
Multiple times.
Multiple times, but still he got over, didn't he?
Because of the United States government.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But the point is that who can argue with billions of dollars? Let's hook into that, man. But you've got this idea, the idea of being a self-made man, self-made woman. That hero. Well, these are the big meta-narratives, and it's why religion becomes really, really important and meaningful. And why they become so powerful for the ways that they connect people in their individual stories to much bigger stories. Now, C.S. Lewis, was a master at telling stories, and Tolkien was a good guy that was a master at telling stories. But notice the themes that come out of the stories. Why is it better to be a poor guy who sacrifices and who ultimately triumphs over evil? Why is it better to be self-sacrificing? Why is it better to be committed and loving as opposed to being a selfish a-hole? Well, what you feel in that, the reason why you root for an underdog when they're playing football, the reason why people are geeked about the Cubs maybe doing well this year in baseball.
They're going to win.
Yes. See, and the reason why is because how long has it been since the last Cubby World Series?
Over 100 years.
Yeah, over 100 years. The reason why you care about this is because you are living in the vestiges of a Christian story.
Or you're a Cubs
Or you're a Cubs fan. But the reason why you care about things like that is that it's the latent memory. Well, we're entering into a situation as a culture where people are quite willing to let go of the Christian story, of its truth value. So now the question is, what story connects you? Where does the meta-narrative go? Well, the last guy I'll introduce you to is a guy by the name of Charles Taylor. And Taylor has done a lot of really hard work at mapping out what he calls the secular age. And Taylor recognizes that to a certain extent, human beings are trying to reconstruct their life entirely outside of meta-narratives, entirely from within what he calls the immanent frame. Trying to just have our small stories and not worry so much about connecting them to any bigger story. Because ultimately, if there is no God, there is no religious truth, then the big stories don't matter. So let's sort of cultivate our own garden and be content with that. But there's a consequence for that. One is for religious people, there is no longer any uncontested meta-narrative. I say, gosh, human beings are unique. And the voice of the materialist, thank you for being brave enough to jump in, says, yeah, you ain't that unique after all. Human beings are just one animal after another, and will probably be replaced one day by the dodo bird. Right?
Right.
On the other hand, that reality that there is no uncontested meta-narrative leaves the space haunted. There are little bits and pieces, intimations and longings for the things that God used to replace. And so we're longing for those connections. You know what? You're still going to have a holiday on December 25th, even if you're not a religious person. And the question is who cares about a bunch of animals going extinct? Who cares about whales mourning for their loved ones? Who cares if an elephant